Welcome to That's a Hard No, the podcast about learning to say no and set boundaries to live our best lives. I'm your host, Heather Drago. You may think, because of this podcast, that I'm a boundary setting expert, but I'm not. I'm an expert at struggling to set boundaries. But you know what? I'm working on it, and it is getting easier. Follow along with me as I learn from fellow strugglers and experts so that you too can start saying no without feeling fear, guilt, or FOMO.
You don't know where to go. Unfriendly applications got you feeling low. You're not sure what to do. Weight of expectations is coming down on you. There's a phrase you should know. Tastes so much sweeter than hello. That's a hard no.
Well, hi, Betsy. Thank you so much for coming on our podcast.
Thanks. I'm thrilled to be here.
Oh, it's great. I'm really excited about this topic. It's not something I know a lot about, so I'm excited to learn something new.
Great.
So the Adoption Network shares a sort of slogan, which is adoption is a lifelong journey.
Yes.
So I'd love to start by hearing your insights on this as an adoptee and as a person with experience in connecting with your biological parents in adulthood.
So I was adopted way back when. I was born in 1960 and placed as an infant. And in the 60s and 70s, and probably even 80s, and sometimes even now, adoption is seen as that one-time legal event of getting the child, into the new family, and then have a nice life. There's no difference. Yep.
Yeah, that's
and,
that. Yeah.
So adoption as a lifelong process is, kind of a newer way of looking at it. I think a much more realistic way of looking at it. That there's a lot more involved in that, and it's not about good or bad or better or worse, but it is different. And and so how do we, acknowledge those differences and respond appropriately and give people space to acknowledge their realities within that. And so, that's something that I came to that philosophy kind of on my own through my own search and reunion when I was in my 20s. And then realized it was kind of a budding school of thought out there, larger, than that. And so historically there wasn't organizations to serve people after adoption because, it was a one-time thing and it was over and no big deal. But the change in philosophy gave way to the start of organizations to look at what services might be needed ongoingly.
So looking at it less like just a legal contract and more like
Somebody's life.
a life, yeah, and multiple people's lives intertwined over
Exactly.
many
Exactly.
years. So are you comfortable sharing your story a little bit
Sure,
so people
yeah.
can put what you've just shared in context?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, I was adopted in 1960. My parents were always really open with me, which was great. I'm a staunch advocate that adoption should be talked about openly like anything else. I learned it as I learned concepts and language, and it was never a big deal. It was never a negative thing. But I did have flaming red hair as a kid, and people would ask me all the time, "Where'd you get your red hair?" And it's like, well, I don't know. Are you Irish? Well, I don't know. And so I think, for that and lots of other reasons, I was curious and I wanted to know more about my background. My parents had not been told anything other than what formula I drank on what schedule when I was handed to them.
Wow.
And which was typical.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is that the norm? Yeah.
So, while they were very open and tried to be very positive about my origins, they didn't know squat, and they didn't think like, oh, maybe we could go back to the agency and get more information. That wasn't a thing back then. So I grew up, with a lot of mysteries, and I went to nursing school, became an RN, and through that process it really piqued my interest in terms of medical history, and I learned a lot more about the genetic components of illnesses, and so just on every level, curiosity diminishes trivializes it almost. It's bigger than curiosity.
Oh yeah, I mean that's
and
impactful, life impacting
Yeah.
information
yeah.
that you need to know. So before I run off on that tangent, I'm going to let you finish your story.
So when I was in my 20s, I was working as an RN. I worked in child mental health, and I noticed I was very curious, for lack of a better word. I deeply wanted to know my origins. And at the same time, I noticed that the kids who I worked in an inpatient unit, mostly teenagers, some younger kids, the kids that had found their way to our services, about 20% of them were adopted, whereas
Wow.
2% of the population is adopted. And
Wow.
you would think...
That's interesting.
Yeah, so you would think that any population that's that overrepresented in that type of service, people would be asking why. And so I tried to research it, and there was a little bit out there. There's a couple, there was a little bit documented about why that might be. But it just piqued my interest all the more. And so on that note, I came to the conclusion that secrecy and denial are not promoted positive coping mechanisms in any school of psychotherapy, but somehow they're okay, or we're okay in adoption. And so, what is this? So we just sweep it under the rug. I tried
Right.
to engage the psychiatrists and the, treatment team members, the social workers, all the other nurses, the folks that we work closely with, to be as interested in this as I was, of why is this, why are the statistics like this? And nobody was all that interested, honestly. This was back in the 80s, And so my personal and just professional, it just really peaked for me personally and professionally.
Sure.
But back then, this is pre-internet, so it's hard to imagine. You couldn't just Google, how do I do this, or is
I'm
anybody else doing
imagining
this?
you with the microfiche and the
And-
card files at the library.
Yeah, and there were hardly any books out there on the topic. It wasn't in the media very much. And so I internalized a lot of the negative myths or stereotypes of the day that, maybe this would be really traumatic for my birth parents. I'd be opening Pandora's box. It would be a selfish move on my part to try to learn more at everybody else's expense, even though my adoptive parents were pretty open, I'd be hurting them. There's a lot of that type of stuff swirling around, and that held me back. And when I was 25, I was in a bookstore, and there was a book on the shelf called The Adoption Triangle, and it leapt off the shelf at me. It was wow. And I stayed up all night reading that book. I just gobbled it up.
You
it
finally
was
got some
It was amazing. It
information.
It put into words stuff that I'd never even put into words in my mind, but it was so, innately internal for me. And it was chock full of stories of adoptees and birth parents and adoptive parents and reunions and, people's realities. And for the first time I realized, okay, maybe this could be good for everybody. And if I don't make a move toward searching, and, there's maybe similar things are holding her back, and we could go through our lives not knowing each other when maybe we would want to if we had the
Sure.
opportunity, And so I started a search. I didn't know what I was doing, of course, and you couldn't just Google it. And so I plodded along, and my search took me about a year, which today would take maybe a day. I got information, what's called non-identifying information from the adoption agency. They can't give you names and addresses, but they can give you typically what they have on file in terms of, physical appearance, ethnicity, occupations, a little bit about the story behind the adoption, those types of things. Turned out by the end of my search, I had discovered they gave me the wrong persons by mistake.
Oh,
it was
no.
one page of typed information, and it was
A
about
whole year, and then
somebody
they
else.
give you the wrong information. Wow.
I questioned it at the beginning because, being a nurse, I knew a little bit about genetics, and they said both my birth parents had blonde hair, and it's you don't get a recessive redhead from two blondes, but they have the record and I don't, so I'm plodding along, and it's okay, none of this fits. It was an honest mistake, but it was my life. And so anyways, well into my search, I had joined a reunion registry where people can put their names on file, and if both people in a situation register and they match you up, then they tell you. And this organization had written me back and said, hey, according to our records, Ohio has access to birth records for people adopted before 1964. You can apply for yours. And I didn't even, in my original birth certificate, so every adoptee has 2 birth certificates, one that's made out when they're born, and then the one that's amended to show the adoptive family.
I see.
And that was news to me, that was open to me. I'd been plenty of places in Ohio trying to uncover things, and nobody had told me that. So I sent away for it, and it turns out it was 60 cents a page at the time from Columbus, and they were very efficient. Within 2 weeks, I had my original birth certificate. I remember vividly holding that envelope and knowing, opening this envelope is going to change my life.
Yeah.
I opened it, and there was a birth certificate that said Victoria Faith Boyer. And I thought, wow, she had such a beautiful name. And as I looked more closely, that's what she had named me, which, I just thought I'd be baby girl Smith or whatever,
Yeah.
So Victoria Faith was such a optimistic, uplifting name. And her name was below, and the address where she typically lived, and then the address where she lived during the pregnancy, which was the Florence Crittenden home on Euclid Avenue. She'd been sent away, which again was very
typical
common
of the day.
at that time. I worked at the Cleveland Clinic, and I could see the mansion. It's one of the old Euclid Avenue mansions, and I could see it out my window, the place where she had been. So it was like, wow, this is.
That had to be pretty emotional.
It was
for you.
very,
Yeah.
just picturing,
Yeah.
and that's the place that we'd been together before I was born.
Yeah. Wow.
And that was around Christmas time. And by May, I had uncovered contact information for her. So her name was on my original birth certificate, but of course she, had married and whatever, there was moved. She grew up outside of Philadelphia. I finally found her in Wisconsin and planned very carefully, how do you make contact?
How do you
what
approach?
do you say?
Yeah.
How do you be sensitive to her? I would probably never recommend this in any other situation, but I chose to call her work because I knew she had 3 teenagers and a husband at home, and I had no idea if they knew about me or
Right.
anything about the circumstances there. And I knew that she either owned or managed a small company. It would probably have a door to close. So I literally wrote out a script. And, you don't want to say, oh, I think you're my mother, or, I chose my words very carefully. And I called, and it was an out-of-body experience, watching myself say the words. I said, this is Betsie Norris. I'm calling from Cleveland, Ohio. Is this a good time to talk? I have something very personal to talk to you about. Is this a good time? And she gave me the green
You're so
light.
thoughtful about how you approached.
I put a lot
Really?
into,
Yeah.
how
Even
to,
thinking
how to
she
do
can
this.
close the door. That's
Yeah.
so thoughtful.
And I said I was born February 20th, 1960, and placed for adoption. I've been doing research about my background, which has led me to you. And before I even got all that out, she said, oh, my God, I've been praying for this call for 26 years.
Oh, I'm going to cry. Oh,
I
my
know,
God.
I know. And I had tried to.
Because it's so risky. It's
I had
such
tried
a
to plan
risk.
okay, if she cries, I'm going to say this. If she hangs up, I'm going to do this. If she
it must have
denies
been
it,
terrifying.
she's
What
angry.
if she rejects
I didn't.
me?
Yeah, I didn't have if she's thrilled. So I was speechless. I was so worried about how this would land for her.
Wow.
I had gone over and over in minute detail leading up to that moment, but then I realized it's kind of funny. I should have had a list of questions, or I don't know, something. But I was just
Everything goes out the window, and you get it. Yeah.
But when she said that, I just, the adrenaline that went through my body, the sense of relief, it's like jumping off a cliff with no knowledge if there's a net there or not, and luckily she was very poised, and she said, do you have red hair? And I said, yes. And she said, what do you do for a living? I told her I was a nurse. She started telling me about her mother who had red hair, whose name was Betty, who had been a nurse.
Oh,
And,
wow.
just making family connections. And then a little ways into the phone call, she said, well, Bob is going to be so happy. And I said, well, who's Bob? And it turned out she had married my birth father. They were sweethearts in college.
Okay.
They had been together for a couple of years before the pregnant, or really even maybe 3, the full 3 years. At the end of her junior year, she got pregnant in the spring right before she went home. And, the parents kind of orchestrated what was going to take place from there, as was very typical of the day. And they had continued their relationship and ended up getting married. So the 3 teenagers at home are my full brothers. 2 of them are identical twins.
Wow.
And,
so all of a sudden you had this larger family.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I wanted to make that phone call alone because I knew that it was just so emotional. I couldn't imagine somebody sitting there watching me. I had people on call, like, okay, I'm doing this. I'm going to call you as soon as I'm done. I didn't know how, if I was going to
I love that. You have like a support system in place just in case.
I could have been devastated, or even if I'm thrilled, like, just something, people that know that's happening to share with. My dad, my adoptive father, who was really supportive of all this, had like brainstormed, ways that we could make contact, through a letter. He was really worried that I'd be heard, which I understand, but I had to make that phone call, and I felt it was most sensitive to her. I didn't want her to have a letter that somebody else could find, like somebody else opens the mail, like, Mom, what's going on? I didn't want a third party to call her, and the first thing that she knows about me is that I involve some third party in our private business and something that's probably a very private part of her life, And so, I had to
really
do
admire your sensitivity and respect and thoughtfulness through this whole thing of how you thought about what was best for her and for you.
Yeah.
That's really
so Adoption
really
Network
great.
helps people to do it sensitively,
right,
because and we'll get there, I guess.
Yeah.
But
what were some answers you were looking for that you had always had in your mind, and were you able to get those answers?
Yeah, especially I think because they were married, like the answers just flooded in, and it was hard to digest all the, like, going from knowing nothing to knowing everything. One of the most profound pieces was a piece of medical history. She had malignant melanoma 5 years before I found her, which can be a very fatal form of cancer. Luckily, she was fine. But I've got the freckles and the red hair and the blue eyes, and everybody had always told me to be careful in the sun, but I didn't take it seriously until I knew I had the family history. And so thank goodness that's changed my behavior.
That family health history is so important. Yeah.
And, so that and other medical history, even still, I've been in reunion now for 30, almost 40 years, 38 years or whatever. And even still, when I go to the doctor and they ask medical history, I smile like,
I do know my medical history. Yeah.
It takes on, I found out where I got my red hair. Just, things that many of us, I think, grow up, that these types of things are just a given or they're trivial, were so important because I didn't have access to them. And so having all those answers. My birth mother had he's deceased now, but had a brother who was a genealogist and had written books about the family history back to like the 1500s. And
wow.
So her last name was Boyer, the Boyer book. And it had driven him crazy that there's he knew about me and that, I was out there somewhere, and so it just put a lot of pieces
together. So the kids
together.
Knew about you being out there all the time?
No,
or?
So that was her brothers. Like
her
generation,
brother.
her family knew.
Okay.
Her kids did not know, but she told them right away after I'd found the family. Like actually the next oldest, his birth certificate says he's the second child born to her, and I think she'd always kind of hoped that maybe he would ask or that would come up somehow, but it was
Yeah.
always something that she wanted to tell them, but it's easier to put it, why
It's hard
today,
to
like put it off,
explain. Yeah.
And so she told them right away after I surfaced.
So you talked about this sort of information overload, kind of all this stuff coming at you, and I'm sure then there's this flurry of meeting people and learning all about them and them learning all about you. Like, how did you navigate that? Were there boundaries you put up? Did you kind of soft pedal it a little bit to kind of make it easier on yourself, or were you just kind of open to take it all in?
One of the things that was really helpful, I think, in that very first phone call with her, she had heard actually a radio show, so who knows who's going to hear this and use this, but
right.
she had heard a radio show of an adoptee being interviewed about stuff, and so she was a little bit sensitive to like where I was coming from, and it must have been something that had come up in the show. She told me straight out, I'm going to let you pace this. She told me two things. I'm going to let you pace this, so like I knew she was receptive to whatever I wanted, but I could kind of pace the timing. And then also she said, I respect your adoptive parents' role. They're your parents. They raised you. I'm not going to compete with that. Like that's, I hope we can develop a relationship, but I understand that you've got, because a lot of adoptees feel really split between their adoptive parents.
They feel like they're kind of dishonoring,
Yeah.
The adoptive parents if they are trying to have a relationship with the birth
or just, how do you disrespecting, or just how do you what boundaries do you put around where you're going to spend holidays, or just like where you stand in each family. So in my birth family, I'm very close with them now. They're family to me. I tell people sometimes like I'm their daughter, but they're not my parents, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But my brothers have been uncles and their spouses aunts to my son. Like this all happened before he was born. And so he grew up knowing all these aunts and uncles and grandparents from different sides of the family. But just, how do you put everybody in place? And I don't, even though I've known them for a long time, I didn't grow up there, and it is different, And so that was a bittersweet piece of my reunion, kind of realizing, and it sounds worse than it is, but like I'm not part of my adoptive family as if I was born there, and I'm not part of my birth family as if I grew up there, and that's just part of the reality of my life. And that sounds sadder than it is on a day-to-day basis, but
I
it's
can
true.
sort of relate, and I'm not adopted or anything, but I have sort of a I guess modern family in that I always joke I'm the product of marriage number 1, and I have 2 half siblings that are the product of marriage number 3.
Yeah. Okay.
And we shared a father. And so we did not grow up together. I did not know of them until I was in my early 20s.
Okay.
And they are much younger than me. In fact, I could be my brother's mother. That's the age difference.
Okay.
And so there have been times like when my sister got married where she was off getting ready with her bridesmaids, and I was a guest, but I was not really part of the wedding. And I kind of had a moment of grief where I was like, I'm part of the family, but I'm not really part of the family. And my father chose to do that by keeping us apart. And so there are moments like that, but then I kind of just say, well, okay, that's the reality.
Yeah.
And I'm so blessed to have them now. And I also joke, my father's given me 3 gifts in my life. One was a Kodak Instamatic camera in 1980, and then the other 2 are my siblings, and I'll take it. I'm very happy to have them. And so I just see them as an added blessing. And I was raised as an only child, but now I have these siblings, and, I have a niece, and I have, their spouses. And I feel so blessed to have this added life in my family.
Yeah. And today with DNA testing, there's a lot of people who are discovering those types of things.
Lots of Christmas surprises.
So Adoption Network has expanded to include, what we call DNA surprises. And that could be siblings. It could be the parent that raised you, that raised you, that maybe you both thought was your parent isn't. There's a lot of different permeations that can all take.
Yeah.
So,
well, we'll get into more of that after we take a quick break.
That's a Hard No is brought to you by Clever Girl Marketing, my full-service agency specializing in smart, strategic marketing solutions for businesses and nonprofits. Okay, so you're probably wondering, Heather, what's with the podcast about boundaries? Why not marketing? Well, maybe in the future, but for now, it actually does relate, so bear with me here. Smart marketing, strategic marketing, requires knowing what to say no to and why. Businesses and nonprofits get inundated with marketing options and offers every day. We help you cut through all that noise, focus on your specific needs, and develop actionable strategies that are doable and actually make sense. Whether it's websites, SEO, email, social, or traditional channels, we're experienced in all of it. So if you need help figuring out your marketing, visit our website, clevergrowmarketing.com, and get in touch. I have a set of friends who are, without getting into any detail, are in the similar boat as your birth parents.
Mm-hmm.
You know, early in their relationship, they had a child. They didn't really know each other very well. They decided to put the child up for adoption, but then they ended up getting married and having 3 more children. Very similar. And luckily, they were able to reunite with their birth child, and I think they're very happy. And there's been a lot of acceptance between them and the adoptive parents and stuff. But I know that when I first heard the story, before they reunited with their child, there was a lot of grief and trauma. It was very upsetting, especially to the mother. And so there's a lot of dialogue or rhetoric or discussion these days about how adoption is traumatic for either the birth child or the birth parents. And I wonder if you have any insights on that, and especially knowing, it sounds like you had a really lovely experience, but I'm sure the angst of, am I going to disappoint my adoptive parents, and this almost years-long search trying to find your birth parents, like, what can you speak to regarding trauma and adoption? Or do you think it is traumatic?
I do think there's trauma. I think that can vary based on the circumstances. I think for birth parents, it's a very tangible loss. And, you know, you lost your child, and that's...
Whether you chose to or not.
Yeah, and that's extremely, can be and is typically, extremely traumatic. So even if you go on to have other children, it doesn't replace that child that you lost. For an adoptee, the trauma is kind of swept under the rug more because you have a family that replaces that family, and at least in the years I was growing up, you're not encouraged to think about that family, like it's not, which in some ways makes it more traumatic.
Right, like you're discouraged to talk about it, and but that doesn't keep a child from thinking about it and wondering and and then feeling bad about thinking about it.
So ambiguous loss.
Yeah.
I went through, really realizing like, okay, this all took place before, I was pre-verbal, and, but it's still in there. Like, I think, until relatively recently in the history of adoption, we didn't realize that an infant, or the history of looking at infants, that infants are experiencing things. And so like I was placed at 2 weeks, in part because my birth mother, probably in large part because my birth mother really championed that and wanted me placed right away because she understood early childhood stuff. But the going scenario, and with both my brothers who were also adopted, I'm a middle child, kids were often held back for 3 months, 6 months in foster care or in an infant home, so they could be assessed to make sure they're normal.
That just sounds terrible. Like, because you hear about there's like attachment disorder.
There was nothing going on with that baby because they're just a baby.
Awful.
They don't know the difference.
That's awful. That is for sure a trauma.
But, yeah. So there's a lot of adoptees. There's a book out there called The Primal Wound, which is a theory. Not everybody subscribes to it, but I think for many adoptees, that's a very profound loss. Losing that person that you've heard their voice, and there's a lot more. There's a bigger body of knowledge now about in utero bonding than there used to be. We also work with a lot of kids through Adoption Network that were adopted through foster care, and went through, very tangible traumas during their early
Sure.
years, and, losing family and sometimes multiple families, being abused, neglected,
Separating from
abandoned.
siblings. Yeah.
Yeah, siblings, that's a big,
Yeah.
So, there can be lots of different types of trauma. And even for adoptive parents, in different ways, and it depends maybe how they were prepared, or how aware they were maybe of some of those issues. But parents that came to adoption through infertility, were looking to adopt the child they couldn't have, but this is a different child, and
Yeah, and
not every
infertility
kid
treatment is
fits
traumatic.
the same
I've,
way.
kno-
Yeah,
I've
so,
known
going
several
through that loss
couples
and-
who've gone through that, and it's a grueling,
so
difficult process.
So, and if parents haven't fully grieved the loss of not conceiving, that can carry over into how they parent.
Yeah.
And sometimes adoptees, it's an opportunity to discuss, to examine nurture and nature, and some adoptees just don't really fit that well in their adoptive family. They're very, very different. So I've talked to some people that feel like they really had to kind of squash who they were to fit in, or they weren't understood, and that can be traumatic too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, to feel like you can't be yourself, your true self.
Yeah, or that you're always disappointing everybody because of who you are.
Yeah.
And what comes
And
naturally
you might not
to
even
you.
understand why.
Yeah.
If they haven't told you.
Yeah, and they it might be great stuff, like an adoptee who likes to read or is very artistic, or and is in a family that's not what they value. Like it could be, doesn't mean there's something bad. Just,
right.
You're just really different.
They're really into
what comes
math
to you
or
naturally is
something,
really
and
different. So all of those things I think can be traumatic. I've been doing this long enough that there didn't used to be a word for it, but we would talk about some of this stuff, but there wasn't really a term. So it's been interesting in recent years that trauma is something that's talked about, that's studied, that, there's an approach to, help it heal, that it's something that's much more out there and understood now, thank goodness.
I know this could be a whole nother topic of a podcast, but can you touch briefly on some of the approaches in case someone is listening to this and they're like, yes, I can relate to feeling trauma and I'm hurting, and like, what are some avenues people can look to?
Well, there's a whole body of knowledge out there about trauma-informed care, and that I think mental health professionals are much more aware of approaching things that way. And so a lot of it in adoption can be looking at, and we do this with adoptive parents, helping them to see why your child might be acting the way they are instead of just punishing them. And what have they been through? What are they acting out? Being sensitive to where the other person is coming from and why they might be doing what they're doing. For adoptees, giving yourself permission to be who you are and feel that and find supports for that. So that can be part of it.
So look to a trauma-informed mental health professional to help guide you, whoever you are.
My general experience with mental health professionals has been that there are mental health professionals that know more about adoption, and that people should really try to seek them out, adoption competent therapist.
That's interesting.
It's kind of a new term, but I've seen therapists who, innately get it. I've seen therapists that don't. And, I've heard from a lot of birth parents or adult adoptees or adoptive families that, they went to therapists who
just didn't understand
it, and that they can do more, obviously they're not trying to, but that you can do more harm than good.
Right.
Some therapists like, adoption's not important, you're just blaming everything on that, or it's like, well,
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
You need to have someone who understands the ins and outs and the
or
different
therapists
things.
on the flip side that think maybe adoption is everything and are dealing with, so you got to have somebody that's really got some knowledge in that area.
Yeah, interesting. So as an adoptee, were there boundaries you needed to set or things you needed to say no to throughout your discovery process, or even after that, or even as a child? Were there boundaries you set to kind of I don't know, protect yourself, or if people were nosy with questions, like in school, or are there boundaries you set throughout your life relating to adoption?
A lot of adoptees do. For me, that wasn't what fit as much. So like I mentioned, I had flaming red hair, and people would literally stop my mom and I on the street when I was 4 or 5 years old.
So nosy.
And
what?
say, oh, where'd she get her red hair? I have a niece. These would be like, little old ladies. And, I have a niece that has red hair like that. Where'd she get her red hair? And I would proudly say, I'm adopted. And they would be, like, oh, my God.
They didn't know how to answer that.
As if I'd announced, I'm a bastard child. But, I just, to me, that was the honest answer. And I was, so probably I had a lack of boundary. I wasn't trying to do it to be shocking, but I did notice, okay.
Your family's never taught you it was a bad thing. So why would you think it would be?
Yeah.
Right?
Although I did also notice that my mom would often answer, oh, there's Sandy hair in the family, or we have some Irish heritage, which, was
just
covering
to
it
shut
up.
it down.
Yeah, and so it's kind of like, well, that's not the honest answer, So, but I do know adoptees who don't want their friends or their teachers or different people to know. They want to keep control of the message. I think one boundary for me, and I think I kind of mentioned this, but when I was searching, I wanted to do it myself. I knew that there were people out there that I could just hand over a couple thousand, not that I even had a couple $1,000s at that stage of my life. I was in my early 20s, but that I could just pay to do this. But for me, that was putting my life back together. And so I firmly rejected outside help. It was a really therapeutic year for me to have control of that.
The discovery process. Yeah.
And so that was a boundary of, or even like my dad really suggesting, he wanted the minister of our church to find the minister of a church in Milwaukee, where my birth mother lived, to find a social worker who could contact her. And it was like, no.
That's a lot of layers.
Yeah.
That's a lot of layers.
And he meant well, but
yeah,
it was
sure.
like, that's not, this is between me and her.
Yeah. It's a very personal, intimate
And if somebody's going to hear her voice, I want
right?
it to be me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I think it brings it full circle. Giving birth to a child is very personal, very intimate.
Yeah.
And then that reunion,
it was my way
you
of
made it
honoring
just as
her,
intimate. Yeah.
Honoring her place. And
yeah.
So I guess that was part of what, and I was really close with my dad. I didn't reject his suggestions.
Sure.
Because I didn't think he was a wise person. It wasn't a fit for what I needed at that moment.
Are there other boundaries that you've heard of other people setting, or that people should consider when they're searching for their biological parents?
I think there's a lot of myths out there still. I think a lot of people are held back by, feeling like they're going to hurt people or not knowing where this is going to land. I had a good friend, actually my roommate at the time that I started my search, who I was keeping up to date about my search, and as I got closer to finding, she realized I was actually going to complete this and call this person. She said, well, how far are you going to take this? And I just realized, okay, you're not living in my shoes. Like, you're not walking in my shoes. You don't know. Yeah, you don't understand. So I think surrounding yourself with other adoptees finding your community, finding your people who have been through these types of things so that you're understood, truly understood.
Maybe talking to people who've been through it.
Yeah, right. And so that was a huge piece of me starting Adoption Network. I felt misunderstood, and I wanted to find people that understood.
Yeah.
And so finding, I just felt so powerfully like there needs to be a place where people can come together and talk about these things. As an adoptee, I'd never heard a birth parent speak about being a birth parent. And, so like if you even think about it, you said those birth parents, but for the most part, we all know a lot of adoptees. We all know a lot of adoptive parents. It's
very mysterious.
And for every adoptee, there are 2 birth parents out there, but we almost never know who they are.
Yeah.
And so, finding ways to combat that isolation, I think, is huge.
Yeah. I imagine that one of the fears an adoptee might have to overcome is the boundaries that their birth parents might set up when approached. Do you have any thoughts on that, or from the birth parent's point of view, what boundaries can they set during the adoption process and then later as the child ages?
So for one, I think the adoptee needs to be sensitive, if they're making a call or writing a letter, that they've had however long to work up to this moment, and for the adoptee, or for the birth parent, it's
Out of the blue.
Out of the blue.
Yeah.
And maybe not. Maybe they're ready to, but they don't know. They don't have any control on the situation. So being sensitive to that. I think part of what you're asking makes me think about open adoption situations. So these days, very different from when I was born. Typically, birth parents choose who the adoptive parents will be from parents who have already completed a home study through an agency, but there might be a pool of parents, and they can look at the profiles and decide which couple or person they think is the best fit for their child. And I see a lot of people both on sometimes the birth parent side, but especially on the adoptive family side, who don't know a lot about adoption, like, oh, why would you want to do that? That's not going to be a good thing. They're going to be, harassing you, or and it's definitely, in my opinion, a much more humane way of placing a child and raising a child. And even in public system adoptions, there's a lot more openness than there ever used to be.
But aren't there upfront boundaries set of we agree on what kind of contact there will be, how frequent it will be?
Yeah, so having some type of agreement, unfortunately in Ohio, you can have an agreement, but it's not legally binding in any way. In many states it is, and we would champion that for Ohio as well, that yes, you lay out up front how often you might see each other, how you'll communicate, how often you'll communicate, so that people can have realistic expectations. And then probably, like in many divorce agreements and child custody situations, the best ones are ones that you put in a drawer and you don't have to be looking at it because it's flowing along. Whether you're doing, the bare minimum or more, like it's comfortable, and so you're not focused on like, oh, what did we say we were going to do? People pull it out when it's a problem.
Yeah, right.
But yes, that sets a standard for what. Yeah. And so even for birth parents and adoptees, I think about talking about that up front. So as I said, my birth mother offered that, like, okay, I'm going to let you, I'm happy to be found. I'm here for you. I'm going to let you pace it. I suppose if I was asking for too much, she might have set some limits. But, I knew the ball was in my court. I see sometimes people, like, they found each other and, they're talking every day for a while, that honeymoon period, and that can't last forever,
Right.
And so then I've seen times where it's awkward of like, okay, she's not calling me. I'm not, like, should I call her? Like, people don't, it's a new relationship and you're getting to know each other and trying to figure out what those boundaries are. And so I always tell people, talk about that. Like, just put it out there
about it,
instead of just letting it get awkward. Or even if it is awkward, then bring up like, okay, what would work for you? This is what would work for me.
So I want to talk about your nonprofit, and I want to talk about the resources you offer, but I have one last question, and this relates to the adoptive parents. And we touched a little bit on secrecy and how unhealthy that can be and how a child internalizes that. What do you think are healthy and not healthy boundaries, whether it's an open adoption or not, for adoptive parents to set?
I think it really depends on the situation.
Everyone's favorite answer. It depends.
Well, so
no, but that's fair.
Somebody might be placing a child for adoption because they're still in high school. They might be placing a child for adoption because they're a drug addict.
Right.
I mean, there could be mental health problems in the family. Their extended family might know and be supportive. Maybe nobody knows. Like, there's so many different situations, and so obviously, if things are really difficult and stressful, then I would still champion finding ways to keep things open to the degree that you can, but you're maybe going to be in a position where you're setting a lot more limits or really finding ways
for the well-being of the child.
That be a positive situation. Obviously, you don't want the child to be, thrust into chaos.
Yeah.
And so So I'm trying not to have it be a cop-out, but I do think
No,
it depends
that's
a lot
fair.
on the situation.
That's totally fair.
And the same with the birth parents. I think a lot of people in open adoptions think that the birth parents are going to want more than the adoptive parents, and that's not always the case. I've seen birth parents who maintained openness for a while, and then that's can be hard on them too. And so maybe they get married and move and whatever, and they're not always in contact as much. I've seen a lot of adoptive families where they want more than they're getting, which isn't what people think. They think, if anything, the birth parent's going to be like stalking you. So I know adoptive families who would like more contact with the birth parent than they're getting in open adoptions. I think often people think it's the birth parent's going to want more or too much, or it's going to be overwhelming. Sometimes it can be the other way around. But I think having an agreement up front where you've at least determined what you think is going to be the best thing moving forward, and that doesn't mean it's inflexible, but
right. You can always
having some
renegotiate the
agreement.
boundaries as long as you're communicating about them. Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell me more about your adoption network and what kind of resources are available for adoptees, adopters.
Sure. So I started Adoption Network in 1988, so a couple of years after my reunion, and again, there wasn't an internet to just for people to find each other. So we had an article in the Plain Dealer, and it had my home phone number, and my phone rang off the hook.
Wow, your home number, brave woman.
I hadn't really thought it through. I tell people I was young and naive and energetic, and it's a good thing I was. I didn't know much about a nonprofit organization. I didn't know, hadn't really I went back to school to get a certificate in nonprofit management, and I realized some people write out a business plan and they raise money and then they do this. I just kind of did it.
That's how I started my business.
So, so there's something to be said for that. But I just thought, there should be a place where people can come. There's a lot more to adoption than just that placement piece. And the only adoption things out there are the agencies with the placement piece. And it was an idea whose time had come. There were people coming out of the woodwork. So we help adult adoptees, birth parents in search and reunion. We help adoptive families as they're raising their kids, often kids that have had a tough start in life and maybe make them not the easiest kids to parent. And so, helping them to use a trauma-informed approach and be successful. We have branched out into services for people who are donor conceived, or, as I was mentioning, DNA discoveries, people who have these complicated family situations that are not adoption, but not that different. And we do a lot of advocacy work in Columbus, so mostly on the state level. We've gotten the records opened for adoptees to be able to, so the post-1964 records, so that adoptees can get their original birth certificate and know more about themselves. And we've had projects on and off over the years with the county around kids in foster care who are lingering in long-term foster care, and how to create practices that help them to get adopted and make that a positive thing.
Yeah.
Promoting the adoption of even teenagers.
Yes.
We all need a family after we turn 18 too,
Yeah, yeah. Don't get me started on what happens to foster kids when they age out of the system.
Yeah.
It's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, one of
people.
our public policy initiatives is siblings and keeping them together, or finding ways to keep them in contact if they're separated through the foster care process.
So you offer a whole lot of support services.
Yeah.
So how can people find you?
On the web is probably the easiest way. It's www.adoptionnetwork.org.
Wonderful.
And they can look at all the range of services that we've got
Wonderful. There. Wonderful. We'll make sure to put a link on our website and in our show notes. And
let me mention the phone number too, just in case somebody
Sure.
wants to pick up the phone.
Feel free.
216-325-1000.
Okay. And do you primarily help people in the state of Ohio, or do you also help people across the country?
With DNA searching now, we can help in that service anywhere. We have support meetings that are all now on Zoom thanks to COVID. But that we've found such a broad audience. We have people from all over the country that participate in a lot of our Zoom groups. We also have a Zoom group for birth mothers specifically.
Oh, wonderful.
And a lot of our adoptive family services in person for the parents and the kids. But we do have some Zoom services. We have a a parent support group for transracially adoptive parents. It's on Zoom once a month. So people can be anywhere. They don't have
Wonderful.
to be here
That's
for
wonderful.
most of it.
Well, I really appreciate what you're doing. Your story's amazing. Thank you for opening up and sharing with us. And
Thank you.
Just keep up the amazing work.
Thanks.
That's a Hard No is a production of Clever Girl Marketing, my little agency in Cleveland, in partnership with our friends at Evergreen Podcasts. Many thanks to our amazing team, including Maura Del Rosario, our production and marketing coordinator, Noah Fouts, our amazing producer, editor, and composer who wrote our theme music and performed it with his band, The Big Leagues, and our new video producer and editor, Kay Holmberg. You can find show notes and resources on our website, and you can find other fun stuff on our socials. We're Hard No Podcast. Find your no, then say it with me.
That's a hard